Welcome to the session of installing Microsoft Dynamics GP 2018. Initially, I'm going to start by running the setup application. So you might be challenged to enter or authorize the application for running. Click yes, and this will initialize the setup process. Note that the first thing is you would get the installation screen. So if you click Microsoft Dynamics GP, this will take you to the window where you can select the country and region that you're installing for. GP is supported through a number of regions. So you have South America, Germany, Hong Kong, Latin America, Luxembourg, etc. In my particular case, I'm going to select the United States, which will then select the appropriate dictionary with the right language for this particular region and features to go along with it. So if we click next here, I can then select the license terms or agree to the license terms. Obviously, if you do not accept the license terms, there's no possibility to continue. So we'll just go along and say accept the license terms agreements. And next, I am presented with a screen of features that I can install with my core Microsoft Dynamics GP product. In this case, I'm going to choose fixed access. All you got to do is select the option to run from your computer. I'm going to select multilingual checks because I do a lot of work with multilingual. And I'm going to select SafePay as I'm testing all the products that integrate with it. So at this point in time, I'm just going to choose next. I am presented with a default installation path. I can choose to accept that or continue. And if we click next here, I am then allowed to enter the server name where I'm going to install uh, um, the SQL Server objects. In this particular case, if you already have a data source in place, you can choose not to create the data source. I don't have a data source created for this, so I'm going to do this selection. Now, ever since GP 2013 R2, you are able to select or enter the instance of your system database. By default, it's called Dynamics. But if you are actually wanting to customize the environment a little bit more, you can choose um, the particular or enter the particular name that you want to assign to the system database. So I am now ready to install the program. I'm just going to click the install button. This should go fairly quick. The installer calculates all the installation path and objects that are going to be laid down. It basically calculates all the resources that are needed based on the settings that I chose previously, and that's going to perform the installation for me. So we'll just hold tight and, um, and wait for this to complete. Okay, so once the installation is completed, we are now ready to launch GP utilities, which will allow us to really perform the full installation of the product, lay down the SQL Server objects at the database level, and prepare our environment for installation. So I'm going to launch utilities here. The first thing I'm going to do is just type GP utilities, and here is my utilities application. This is just going to prompt me to continue, trust this publisher, in this case Microsoft, so I'm just going to say yes to launch the Dynamics.exe runtime engine. And subsequently, I'm now challenged with entering the credentials that would allow me to install Microsoft Dynamics GP at the database level. Please keep in mind that there's no need to use the SA user. So long you have a user with the following credentials: SQL Server that belongs to the sysadmin role in SQL Server, or is a member of the DB creator fixed role, or is a member of the security admin fixed role, you are able to actually use that particular user to lay down the objects. So I'm just going to enter the credentials for my SA user, click on OK, and then this is going to actually present me with now the options to continue the installation. So a little welcome screen. If you are going to do a little bit more than just a basic installation, I always recommend you choose the advanced option, which will then ask you for a series of other questions that typically you won't be prompted to through the basic. One of those questions is particularly where you want to lay down your system database. So for this particular case, I already have a folder called SQL Server on my machine, and I am just going to select that folder. That's where I'm going to save my data folder, and I'm going to replicate the same folder for my my log my log file. Now, if you're doing this in a server environment, it's always recommended that you have a separate um, physical drive that is going to host your data files versus a separate physical drive that's going to host your log files. Now, keep in mind that there are some RAID considerations for each one of those, a number of disks, etc. So I do recommend you visit the system requirements page at https mbs.microsoft.com/partner source if you're a partner, or slash customer source if you're a customer. So for here, we're going to click next, and now we are entered um, or we are prompted to enter the account framework. Here we're going to enter the maximum length for the account and the maximum length for the segments. Now, this will be a topic of a different discussion, but for now, I'm going to go with the default maximums that I can enter. But what I've seen is if you actually shortchange yourself here, making changes to the account framework, although not impossible, will require additional tools in the future. So now that I have defined the maximums, I can now define the length. I can define the segment name and the length for each segment. But again, you can configure these after the fact. When you set up each company, you can set up each account segment name, etc. So this is not a requirement here, but careful calculation is required for any specifics that you have in mind based on your specific environment needs. You can define additional sorting options. By default, the system sets a sorting option for the first segment. Any subsequent segment that you want to include will require um, you setting up that particular sorting option for the segment. So if I say yes here, for example, I can choose to sort on segment 2, whatever segment 2 represents for you, or I can choose to sort on segment 3. What the system will do is it will particularly set up indexes on at the database level that will allow for faster data recovery and also reporting. So I'm just gonna skip that step here. Once I'm done here, there's a summary of the account framework settings that we chose. We can click next. If you are using web client, you are prompted to set up the proxy account that's going to be used in order to access the database objects when you are integrating with either Windows Active Directory or Office 365 um, accounts, um, also known as organizational accounts. Um, as these particular configurations do not have specific user accounts at the SQL Server level. So this is a proxy account that is used, and this proxy account allows when you're using web client for these particular users to or Active Directory accounts or organizational accounts to access the database objects. So here, I'm not gonna worry about that right now. So I'm just gonna unselect this option, or so leave it chosen, but just unselected, I'm sorry, and just click next. And if I am going to use web client, you're prompt to also choose what type of authentication you are going to use. In this particular case, Microsoft Dynamics GP supports two type of authentications, either with Windows accounts, or your traditional Active Directory accounts, or organizational accounts, which are your typical Microsoft Azure or Office 365 tenant accounts. So just gonna leave it to Windows accounts for now. You are now also prompted to set up the system password if you want to. Um, there's two schools of thoughts around this, and typically I would use a system password if I am not gonna have quite a bit of security set up by the time my application is deployed, or I can actually choose to use the system security tasks and roles to define access to specific windows, even the system windows, if needed. I am more of the school of thought of using the application security, so I typically do not set up a system password. But if that is something you do, you can actually set it up here, confirm that password, and then click next. So now this is going to run through the actual process of setting up the system database based on the settings that I configured, and I hit finish and off it goes. Okay, so we are now presented with the option of deploying your business intelligence reports. So that's primarily your Microsoft SQL Server Reporting Services reports and your Microsoft Excel reports and data connections. Now, this is a step that you can choose to do here. This step is optional, but if you want to go ahead and do it now, that's something that you would have to have previously configured. You will have to have Microsoft SQL Server Reporting Services already pre-configured, and certainly know where you're going to place your Excel reports and data connections. So um, for the purpose of this video, I'm going to include these two options and click next. So now the next thing I'm presented is with the option to deploy the reporting services, you can have two different modes of deploying it. One is a native mode, or one is SharePoint integrated. So depending on your particular settings, you will be able to set up these options accordingly. For now, I'm going to deploy native mode since I don't have SharePoint installed here, and this will be on my local machine and in the report server folder for my report server URL. And then I'm gonna point to my report manager. So that would be again my local machine slash reports. So that's pretty straightforward. You can actually set up the instance name if you want for this particular installation. So if you have multiple installations of GP, say a test, a production, and a staging environment, you can have different folder names that you can store those reports in. So I'm just gonna click next here. Then the system is gonna actually try to connect to that location and set up the reports for me. And meanwhile, it does that. A couple things occur here. So it's validating my credentials. If the external report location exists, then it will create the actual folder name, and then it will attempt to deploy the different reports that are prepackaged with Microsoft Dynamics GP. So let's give this some time and hope that it moves on to the next step. Okay, good. So the next thing now is to set up my Excel reports where those are going to be set up, particularly the reports and the data connections. So typically, if I'm going to have these shared across the board, I can choose to share them on a network share. I can choose to share them on SharePoint. It depends what you're using. In this particular case, if you choose SharePoint, then you'll also have to define the SharePoint side, the data connections library, and specify the reports library itself. Since I'm working here locally, I'm just going to choose a network share. And for all intents and purposes, I'm just going to choose a folder on my local machine. And in particular, I think I'm going to do something like F colon GPXL and hit next. And now I'm actually prompted to add the sample company if needed. So I can process this now, and this will actually go ahead and ask me a couple of other um, pieces of information. Note that the location is defaulted from the location that I set for the system database. You can actually change the name now also of the sample company database, but you only have the ability to enter up to 5 characters still for the database name. I am not entirely sure whether that continues to be a limitation, but nonetheless a limitation. So we'll just hit next here and click finish. So that's going to set up our sample company database for us. This is going to be a little bit more um, involved than laying down the system database, but it shouldn't take that much longer, that much more longer than that process. So let's sit tight and see where we go with this. So once all table structures are created, the next thing that is done for us is setting up the table structures for load the table indexes for all those particular tables. And those table indexes obviously will allow us faster data access based on the type of data that we're inquiring. Okay. Once the indexes are completed, then we lay down all the table auto procedures. Those are the procedures that usually are prefixed with the 3-letter characters ZDP, and they basically allow different or the dexterity application to use those particular procedures to access, retrieve data, write data back to the database. Um, since the SQL query is precompiled because it's a stored procedure, then the execution plan is known that particular operation, data operation. So that's the reason why there are table auto procedures in place. It's just to allow faster data access to to and from the application, from the Microsoft Dynamics GP application. Synchronizing the table structure is pretty much sets up the GL account master table and every other table that has a reference to a particular account. That is done so the synchronization is done against the um, account framework. There are other reports option tables that also get involved in that process. Now, loading the required data is basically loading all the sample data that belongs to the sample company. So that basically gives you some play data to showcase Microsoft Dynamics GP in your demos, or simply to take it for a spin. So now that the required data is completed, um, there's a slew of stubs that are loaded, in particular the connect stored procedures, um, and a number of additional tables like the WK posting validation state, um, and so on. Views, then triggers, and then the user-defined functions that are also used. And finally, the stored procedures that are needed to or called from the Dexterity applications that are installed. Okay, so the same thing happens here. You're presented with a deployment option for reporting services reports. So I'm just going to click next here. Note that by default, these values are filled in for me based on the original configuration of the system database. The folder name is going to be the same instance that we set up initially, except now for each company you will be having a subfolder um, that is created for you. So the network share the same. The only thing I get here in additional is a subfolder for my company, and then I'm gonna hit finish here. Then reports are gonna then be deployed for me, in particular my SSRS reports and my Excel reports. As you can tell, the Excel report deployment should be fairly quick, as those are standard Excel files. The reporting services reports will take a little bit longer. So that concludes the actual installation process. Now, if you go ahead and launch Dynamics GP, it will come up with this splash screen, and then typically this will be your sign-on screen where you can um, begin setting up new users or using the existing functionality with the test company. It all depends what your intentions are, but this will basically allow me to sign in. The first thing, upon the first installation, the SY01700 table gets updated with all the get messages that are displayed through the application. So that is loaded from the dictionary into the actual SQL tables. So there we go. And the menus that are initialized on all personal settings applied. So once I'm in the test company, I am now able to set up my specific profile based on the organization that I have that I'm working for. So let's say I work in a wholesale and distribution environment. I can set up that particular profile, and depending on whether I'm IT operations manager, accounting manager, accounts payable, accounts receivable, etc., I can then choose sub profiles that fit my particular needs that will then customize the desktop uh, area for me. So now the next thing is to go ahead and set up additional companies based on you know, your particular needs, and begin deploying and setting up your Microsoft Dynamics GP environment. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope you like it.